At an age when most children were still learning to read, one Serbian boy was already wearing a military uniform. He was 8 years old. He had not joined the army because he dreamed of becoming a soldier. He had not been raised for war. Instead, the First World War came to his village, destroyed his family, and left him with nowhere to go. His name was Momčilo Gavrić. Within days, this little boy would go from being a child in a Serbian village to becoming a soldier in the Serbian army. And his story would take him through some of the hardest years of the First World War. He would cross mountains with an army in retreat. He would survive terrible conditions. He would be wounded. He would rise through military ranks while still a child. And by the time the war ended, Momčilo Gavrić was only 12 years old, yet he had already spent almost half his childhood as a soldier. Momčilo was born on May 1, 1906 in the village of Trbusnica near Loznica in western Serbia. He was the 8th child of Alimpij and Jelena Gavrić. The Gavrić family lived in a rural area beneath Mount Gučevo. Life was very different from the cities. Families depended heavily on farming and local work, and children were part of everyday family life from a young age. Momčilo was still only 8 when everything changed. In the summer of 1914, Europe was entering a war that would eventually involve much of the world. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo had triggered a crisis between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Within weeks, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The fighting quickly reached Serbian territory. Villages near the border and along important military routes became caught in the conflict. For Momčilo's family, the war was no longer something happening far away. It had arrived at their home. In August 1914, Austro-Hungarian troops entered the area around Trbusnica. According to Serbian military and historical accounts, members of the Austro-Hungarian 42nd Home Guard Division killed Momčilo's parents, several of his brothers and sisters, and his grandmother. Their home was burned. Momčilo survived only because he had been away from the house. His father had sent him to an uncle to find a horse-drawn vehicle. That simple errand saved his life. When Momčilo returned, the family he had left behind was gone. He was 8 years old. There was no home to return to, no parents waiting for him, and almost no family left. What does an 8-year-old do in a situation like that? Momčilo went looking for the Serbian army. He made his way through the difficult terrain around Gučevo, eventually reaching Serbian soldiers from the Drina division. Somewhere along that journey, the direction of his life changed completely. The soldiers heard his story. Instead of sending him away, they took him in. Major Stevan Tukovic, who was connected with the Serbian artillery unit, accepted the boy. An adult soldier named Miloš Mišović was assigned to look after him. Momčilo was now living among soldiers. He was not simply a refugee traveling with the army. He became attached to the unit, and soon he became a soldier himself. The unit was the 6th Artillery Division of the Serbian Army. Artillery units operated large guns and played an important role in the battles of the First World War. For Momčilo, this was an enormous change. Only weeks earlier, he had been living with his family. Now he was wearing a military uniform and living alongside grown men who were preparing for battle. The army even had a special uniform made for him because ordinary military clothing was designed for adults. His size made it obvious how young he was, but the army did not simply keep him around as a mascot. Momčilo became involved in military operations. One of the stories associated with his first days with the unit concerns the Battle of Ser in August 1914. The Serbian army was fighting Austro-Hungarian forces in one of the first major Allied victories of the First World War. Momčilo was allowed to participate in the artillery action. Accounts say that the experienced soldiers prepared the gun and helped him operate it. The details of exactly what he did have been retold differently over the years, but his presence with the unit during the fighting is well established. And after the Battle of Ser, Momčilo was promoted to the rank of corporal. Think about that, he was 8 years old. He was not old enough to understand the world of politics that had caused the war. He was not old enough to vote. He was not old enough to live independently, yet he was wearing a uniform and carrying a military rank. And this was only the beginning. The war continued. Serbia would face repeated attacks from the armies of the Central Powers. Momčilo remained with the Serbian forces. At one point, the army was pushed back toward the interior. And then came the disaster of 1915. Serbia was invaded by the forces of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Bulgaria. The Serbian army was forced into a desperate retreat. Instead of surrendering, large numbers of Serbian soldiers and civilians attempted to escape through the mountains toward the Adriatic coast. This became one of the most difficult episodes in Serbian history. The retreat took the army through Albania during the winter. The terrain was difficult, food was limited, the weather was harsh. Thousands of people died during the retreat from disease, exhaustion, hunger, and exposure. Momčilo was only 9 years old. Yet he went with the army. He had gone from a village child to a soldier, and now he was part of an army struggling simply to survive. Eventually, the surviving Serbian forces reached the Adriatic coast. Many were evacuated to the Greek island of Corfu. For the exhausted Serbian army, Corfu became a place to recover and reorganize, but the war was not over. the Serbian forces were rebuilt with Allied support and eventually sent to the Salonika front in Greece, and Momčilo went with them. During this period, there was at least some effort to give him an education. While the army was stationed in Greece, he attended school for a time. That detail is easy to overlook. It shows just how unusual his situation was. He was simultaneously a child who needed an education and a military participant who had already experienced years of war. Then he returned to military life. In 1916, Momčilo was around 10 years old. He was involved in fighting near Kajmakchalan, a strategically important mountain position on the Salonika front. This was some of the toughest fighting of the campaign. Momčilo was wounded during the fighting. He survived, and according to Serbian military accounts, his service was recognized with another promotion. He eventually became a junior non-commissioned officer, commonly translated as a lance sergeant or junior sergeant. So by the time Momčilo was 10, he had already gone from civilian child to corporal and then to a higher military rank. It is difficult to imagine what that meant. Most children his age were thinking about school, friends, games, and family. Momčilo's childhood had been shaped by marching, military camps, battles, evacuation, and survival, and the war still had years to go. The Serbian army remained on the Salonika front. For years, the opposing forces faced each other across difficult terrain in Greece and the Balkans. Then in September 1918, the Allies launched a major offensive. The Salonika front began to collapse. The Serbian army advanced. The breakthrough eventually helped force Bulgaria out of the war and opened the way for the liberation of Serbia. Momčilo was there. He was about 12 years old. He had entered the war at 8. Now he was taking part in the final campaigns. The Serbian forces moved north. They retook territory. They entered Belgrade, and eventually, the advance continued into other parts of the collapsing Austro-Hungarian Empire. When the First World War finally ended in November 1918, Momčilo was still a child, but he was also a veteran. He had survived the destruction of his family. He had survived years of military service. He had survived the retreat through Albania. He had been wounded, and he had taken part in the final advance of the Serbian army. He was 12 years old. The army eventually demobilized him. And suddenly, Momčilo had to face a problem that many soldiers experience after war. What happens when the war is over? For Momčilo, the question was even harder. He had spent most of his childhood around soldiers. His family was gone. His village had been transformed by the war. He needed an education and a future. Help came from British charitable organizations that supported Serbian war orphans. Momčilo was sent to England. For approximately 3 years, he attended school in London at the Henry Wright School. It was another extraordinary change. The boy who had crossed mountains with the Serbian army was now living in Britain and studying. He had gone from the battlefield to a classroom. Eventually, he returned to Serbia. But military life was not the only thing he knew anymore. He learned graphic design. He obtained a driving license. He married a woman named Kasara. He worked at the Varpa paper mill in Belgrade. For a time, it seemed that the war had finally become part of his past. But history was not finished with him. Europe entered another period of conflict. The Second World War began in 1939. Germany invaded Yugoslavia in 1941. Momčilo once again found himself living through war. His later life was complicated by political conflict as well. Accounts from his family describe him being imprisoned by German occupation authorities during the Second World War. After the war, he also faced trouble under the new Yugoslav government. His life was no longer the simple story of a celebrated child soldier. He had become an adult who had lived through 2 world wars and the political upheavals that followed them. And for decades, his First World War experience remained relatively unknown outside Serbia. That is one of the strangest parts of his story. Momčilo had once been famous as an extraordinary child soldier, but as the decades passed, his story faded from public memory. Then interest began to return. Historians, journalists, and Serbian institutions started documenting his life more closely. Photographs of the little boy in uniform became part of historical collections. His story was included in books and documentaries. Memorials were created in places connected with his life, and eventually, military facilities in Serbia were named after him. Momčilo Gavrić died in Belgrade in 1993. He was 87 years old. That means the 8-year-old boy who entered the First World War lived long enough to see almost the entire 20th century. He had been born during the final years of the old European order. He survived the First World War. He witnessed the creation and collapse of countries. He lived through the Second World War. He experienced political imprisonment. He watched technology and society change around him. And yet when people remember him, they often return to one photograph, a very young boy wearing a military uniform. It is difficult to look at that image without thinking about the age he was when his childhood ended, but there is an important point about his story. It should not be turned into a simple tale of military glory. Momčilo's story was born from tragedy. He became a soldier because a war reached his village and destroyed his family. His age is what makes the story so shocking. 8 years old, that is younger than many children are when they first begin serious school. Yet Momčilo was already attached to an army. He experienced the realities of a war that killed millions. And by the end of it, he was a veteran at an age when most people had not even reached their teenage years. The title youngest soldier is often used for him, and Serbian official sources describe him as the youngest combatant in the Allied forces. Exact comparisons between every child associated with the First World War are difficult because different armies had different records, and because some children served informally rather than through official enlistment. But there is no real dispute about the central fact. Momčilo Gavrić became a soldier at 8, and he remained with the Serbian army through much of the First World War. His life forces us to look at war from a different angle. We usually imagine soldiers as adults who understand what they are fighting for. Momčilo was different. He entered the war before he was old enough to understand the politics behind it. He did not choose the conflict that destroyed his family, he simply survived it. Then, with nowhere else to go, he found the army. The soldiers became his new surroundings. The uniform became part of his identity, and the war became the defining experience of his childhood. More than a century later, it is easy to look back and focus on the medals, promotions, uniforms, and photographs. But behind all of that was an 8-year-old boy who should have been growing up at home. Instead, he became a symbol of what war can do to childhood. Momčilo Gavrić entered the First World War as a child from a small Serbian village. He left it as a 12-year-old veteran. He survived the battles, he survived the retreat, he survived his wounds, and he survived long enough to build an entire adult life after the war. But perhaps the most unforgettable fact is also the simplest. When Momčilo Gavrić put on a Serbian military uniform in 1914, he was only 8 years old. The war gave him a rank before it gave him a chance to grow up, and when the guns finally fell silent, he was still only 12. His story is remembered because it sounds almost impossible, but the photograph is real, the records are real, and the little boy in that uniform really did live through the First World War. His name was Momčilo Gavrić, and before he was old enough to become a teenager, history had already made him a soldier.